Civil society obviously plays an enormous role in improving public policy. And that's why at the beginning of any development of a new public policy, there's always a public consultation. And that opens up a window of dialogue with not just individuals in society, but also civil society, organized civil society more generally across the EU. And we've seen that multiple times. And any politician will tell you that the quality of public policy is enhanced immeasurably with a properly designed public consultation process. We also live in a time when civil society itself is under threat in many EU member states, but also beyond the EU. So it presents a challenge internally for the structures of the EU, but also in terms of our external policy. So civil society plays a critical role, therefore, and we have to make sure that that space is protected, that it's structured, that it's funded. And in that way, civil society can then disseminate some of the key messages and values that are at the core of the European project. So when I talk about those threats to the EU internally and externally, we have to be aware that we live in a time where democracy is backsliding across the world, but also within the EU. Freedom House produces an annual democracy index, and it has shown democracy has shrunk across the globe for 17 consecutive years, including 2020. And that means that less than 1/5 of the people on the planet live in free countries. And that statistic is very sobering, and it gives civil society, I think, a very profound sense of purpose, because the EU is a global leader in multilateralism, in the rule of law, in the protection of human rights and individual rights. So civil society has a critical role to play in the EU. There is a lot of people who think that democracy is something we can be complacent about, as opposed to having to earn afresh in each succeeding generation. And right now, that is a critical point. The events of the last few years, whether it is migration or climate change, which is not an event, but unfortunately an ongoing process, and also the pandemic, have also brought the civil society's role into focus, apart from that overall threat to democracy. So look, there's an enormous amount of work to do. And our job in the European Parliament is to continually make sure that the space for civil society to carry out that important role is protected, is sustained, and is financed properly. So the major threat to me for the EU is of course climate change, and it's not just for the EU, of course, but it is globally. But thankfully, the EU is undoubtedly a global leader in this space, and the publication of the Fit for 55 package just before the end of the summer really provides a roadmap to how the EU will achieve the ambitions in the Green Deal. But I think that civil society has a much broader scope than this. And I will always say to civil society actors, remember the Sustainable Development Goals, because just one of the Sustainable Development Goals deals with climate action, which is SDG 13. The other 16 deal with a whole range of other issues that global actors just 6 years ago considered to be critical to a roadmap to social equality, to eradicating poverty, to tackling nutrition, and scarcity of resources. But unfortunately, that SDG agenda, Agenda 2030, has been very broadly speaking, taken over by the Green Deal agenda. And I think that's a mistake. And I think what civil society has to remind us about in the EU institutions is that we have to get the balance right between the climate ambition, which is the most urgent issue for public policymakers across the globe, as well as the broader social agenda that's contained in the SDGs. So as it happens, I'm chairing the SDG Alliance in the European Parliament, so it's something that's close to my heart, while also pursuing other files and agendas associated with climate agenda. So I feel as if my role, I can bridge that gap a little bit and encourage people to think in those terms. A lot of the time, lip service is paid to the SDGs, that broader agenda. And in the European Commission, President von der Leyen has made it clear that she says that the SDGs are everybody's responsibility within the College of Commissioners. But it really worries me that when something is everyone's responsibility, in fact, it ends up being nobody's responsibility and isn't advanced properly. So that is one of the critical challenges, is that broader landscape of public policy that civil society should be surfacing all the time for parliamentarians and for decision makers. There are a range of other issues which we can discuss as well. The European Union has developed a European Democracy Action Plan, and it is also developing a toolbox to deal with issues to do with disinformation and challenges to our electoral processes and supports for authentic media and fact-checking and civil society space. And all of this goes together under the attempts to defend the core values of the EU as set out in the treaties of the European Union, the things that bind us together, the binding logic of the European Union, which are those values that I've talked about. So the European Democracy Action Plan contains within it commitments to properly fund civil society, to provide guidelines for civil society engagement in each of the member states. And it also provides further information about the role that civil society can play in the development of public policy. So there is also the Digital Services Act, which relates to this to some extent in providing clarity and certainty and proportionality for the way in which intermediaries act in the civil space, in the civic space, including elections and democracy itself. That's an important development too for civil society, and one to watch very closely. I think therefore, I think what we need is better coordination for the protection of civil society generally. And when there's a crisis in civil society, there really is nobody that takes responsibility for it. And actors have to act in their own interest. They have to protect themselves. But I think the European Commission can play a bigger role here. And particularly in countries where we have seen that space for democratic action and for social activism shrinking in a really insidious way, whether through court actions, whether through the appointments of individuals, whether through the media. These are really gaining strength, and the European Union needs to demonstrate strength on its own part. And I believe there's going to be a showdown in this respect, particularly around the annual Rule of Law report, which has been recently developed and is associated with the disbursement of EU funding. So I think in the autumn of 2021, we'll see some real contestation in this space, and it's important for our democracy. It's important for civil society actors throughout the European Union.